Hey y'all, welcome back. It's finally here, the final season of the Cult of Christianity. And look, I won't lie, it's a little bittersweet, but that's why we'll just make this last one the best one yet, right? We've got amazing stuff planned, thought-provoking interviews, deep dives into the world of cults, and of course, plenty of criticism as we unpack all of this religious garbage. But you can get even more of the show by subscribing for just $5 a month on Spotify. Subscribers get exclusive access to the series Parsing Propaganda, which will now be dropping monthly. And again, we're resuming weekly installments of Amateur Religious Trauma Therapy, where I speak unscripted and kind of use y'all as therapy and hope you gain some insight from my rambling. So if you'd like to spend $5 a month for that, you can do that through Spotify. And that's not all. I've got more in-depth investigations into cults waiting for you on my Substack. And you can also go to my website to find all that information. And especially if you want to keep up with me once this podcast ends, you can go to jverner.com and find whatever you're looking for. I'm excited for the season. I really do believe it's going to be the best. Saving the best for last. So here we go. You ready to dive in with me on this final chapter? Let's go. Hi there, friend. My name is John Verner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to the Cult of Christianity. On today's show, we're joined by incredible writer and speaker Daniella Young, a veteran cult survivor and author of Uncultured. Born into the notorious Children of God religious cult, Daniella's journey from cult survivor to U.S. Army intelligence officer is nothing short of extraordinary. Her experiences in combat and her current pursuit of a master's in arts and organizational psychology at Harvard offer unique insights into group behavior, social norms, and the psychology of cults. Daniella, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much. And speaking of cults, I finished the Harvard Master's. I graduated on my birthday,
Yes.
exactly 20
my
years.
Goodness.
Exactly 20 years after I left the cult. And Tom Hanks was the speaker.
Wow. That's awesome. I also will graduate the day after my 30th birthday this year. So
Amazing.
With my master's. So that's incredible. What a good feeling. That's awesome. Congrats on that. So the first question I ask literally every guest is, how did you relate to religion the first 18 years of your life? Now, you wrote a book about this, so there's plenty to get into.
Yes.
But just kind of overview, maybe what were your emotional relations to your religious life, and maybe focusing not just on the cult itself, but maybe even your own like spiritual beliefs and how that tied into your personality.
So the way I describe it is that I think I was born a questioning atheist to a group of religious fundamentalists, because I cannot remember a time that I actually believed in God. I always kind of felt like we're playing this game. We're playing this game. This is what these people believe. And I know for sure that by the age of 6, and there's a very poignant scene in the book, I was like, no, I'm done. Like, I don't want this God. And so growing up, I was just very critical. I like logic. Cults are not logical. And being born in the Children of God, everything is the Bible and every single thing was religion. And it just wasn't logical to me. When I left the cult, I was only 15. And at that point, I didn't realize it was a cult that I was leaving. It was just this really intense way of life called the family. And I remember my mom asking me, "Do you still believe in Jesus?" And I wanted to say no, but I said yes. And I told myself, I'm just not going to deal with it because I have to survive. And I think this is really common for all of us when we leave cults or high control religion. I call it the first stage of leaving a cult or of deconstruction now is just physically leaving, figuring out how you were going to survive. And I literally told myself at 15, I was like, I'm not going to deal with it. When I'm grown up and successful and like 19 or something, I'll go off to the mountains and I'll think about religion. And by the time I got to be all grown up and successful and 19, I was just firmly an atheist. And a big part of that for me came from when you realize that something you've been trained so intensely to believe that it's literally the only worldview that you've been exposed to, and you find out it's incorrect or corrupted or wrong. I just never felt like I could choose which religion to be. And sort of short of being knocked off my horse on the road to Damascus, what is it that would make me a Christian versus anything else?
That's fascinating that, I also wrestled with thoughts of skepticism when I was younger, and then kind of had a more like conversion type experience, like around 11 or 12.
And John, let me tell you that around 11 or 12, I tried to have conversion experiences so hard. I like really tried to make myself just get in the spirit and get prophecies from God and do all the things that we were supposed to do. And it would last for about 2 weeks. And then I would be like, nah, I'm done with this.
I'm wondering too, as far as worldview goes, like, was the Children of God Christianity to you? Like, did you perceive that was the entire spectrum, or did you not, necessarily go there in your minds? Like, what was your perception of other religions?
So it was definitely Christianity. And with cults, I feel like we have these religious families, like Branch Davidians come out of Seventh-day Adventists, for example, and Children of God came out of conservative evangelical Christianity. In fact, our founder's leader was a pretty famous evangelical revivalist in the 30s. And the way I describe Children of God is that in the 60s and 70s, when everyone was starting their new movements and needing to differentiate themselves, what David Berg did was he took the conservative control of sexuality and he flipped it. And he called it free love, and I call it forced polyamory. But basically, we were uber Christian. I kind of think of the Children of God as like the ultimate Christians, like where the alt-right wants to be. I think we were doing it. We were the ultimate soldiers of God.
Wow. Yeah. And then, so with that, did you, when the idea of cult is maybe starting to creep in, or even when maybe the cult word hasn't creeped in yet, but you're still like, I've left, this is bad, whatever it is, did you think like, oh, I'm leaving a very specific part of Christianity, or just that I'm leaving Christianity? Like, I'm curious about how, because some people would try to make your experience very niche, and I'm not saying it wasn't, but I'm also always worried about the broader thing. So I'm curious just internally how it felt about, like, were you leaving a religion or just that group, if that makes sense?
Well, exactly why I wrote Uncultured is because when I say the high lines of my experience, grew up in an international sex cult, was a woman in the military, people think that my experience is very niche and they can't relate to it. But I can relate to every single Christian in America. Like, I know that my experience was relevant on this broader scale, as you said. So it was definitely the specific, right? It was, I'm leaving the family, and we always talked about ourselves as different and separate. Like, other Christians will probably end up in heaven, but they're not going to be on the top level. They're not the closest to God. We are God's elite army. So it was a little bit of both, or maybe it was a little bit of like getting out of the special forces in the army, like my husband did. where he was also leaving the army, but he was most specifically leaving the special forces. And you have to deal with deconstructing both of those. And so I never thought of myself as a Christian because we were something else. We were the family, the soldiers of God. But I knew at the time that I was leaving Christianity and that I thought I was going to come back around and figure out what version I wanted. And I just never did.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's also interesting, especially that like you needed like a mountaintop experience or something, because I literally did like retreat into a van to live in a van for a year, or a summer, to, try to find myself a little bit. And so it's interesting that even you internally were like, well, maybe that's something I need to do. And then it sounds now like you're like, I don't actually need to do that to find any kind of spirituality. I'm comfortable just learning the science and psychology of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happened is then I immediately went into studying literature and history. And so it was like learning about all of the world and all of humans. And it was also really learning about myth and story and the way myths are created. So, for example, my either senior or junior year, I presented at this conference and my paper was on how you create a god. And I looked at Homer and I looked at Genesis. And then I read this paper in conservative small town Texas.
I love
that. But essentially, and there was one moment I was in a Mexican history class and I learned the history of Moctezuma and their emperor who'd gone away and was reported to come back and was from a virgin birth. And this is when I really started, I just thinking of culture and cult and religion and story and myth and how it's all similar. And this sort of like, what came first, morals or religion? Does religion inform our morals or do morals inform our religion? But very sure I could see, and I put this in the paper, that if you want to create a god, the number one thing they have to be is different from humans. So virgin birth is a pretty logical thing to come up with, even just for a human, even if you've never been connected or influenced by another culture that has that concept.
Oh, yeah. And it was super common in early, centuries to say like our myth guy had a virgin birth, even some kings and such like that, even some humans. So, yeah.
And you know what? Greek mythology, there's some amazing feminist classicists. Natalie Haynes is my favorite. But they basically rewrite Greek mythology and they show you how every single story that developed was just basically just a cover up for sexual abuse. Like all of the people that, quote, Zeus got pregnant, no, those were usually just women who were sexually assaulted by somebody that they couldn't tell on.
Yeah.
And so the family makes up this is the son of Zeus narrative.
Yeah, well, and especially in I mean, Greece, we're talking about, you want to talk about rape culture times 100, I mean, like it's everything surrounded sexual power and just cult. It was like a sex cult, but on a culture, like a literal cultural scale.
And you also see very poignantly in group myth, one, not believing victims, and two, the narrative of, oh, she's crying false rape.
Yeah.
Right. There's two women that do this in Greek mythology, and they are incredibly famous. And there are hundreds of gods and heroes that are just murdering rapists. And we don't talk about that.
Yeah, man, I feel like I could do a whole episode just on myth with you, just because like, so my minor is in like ancient and English literature. So I love all this stuff, too. Nice. But it's interesting that you find a fascination with literature and such. And yet it makes me want to ask what led you to join the military. And can you like share both how that happened and maybe what the moment was in the military where you're like, this is starting to be really familiar.
Yeah. It's interesting how I kind of accidentally chose only things that my background made me good at. So even going into studying literature, like every Western literary class starts with reading the book of Genesis. and describing things, understanding myth through a biblical worldview. And I was very good at that. I was also very good at like reading things and then giving the professor or the adult in my life what they wanted to hear. So I go from being this, valedictorian of my college class after never having an education, and I joined the military. This was actually the hardest chapter of the book to write. It's chapter 17. It's kind of a nothing chapter called Bring Me to Life about when I go to college. But the thing that I finally admitted after 10 years of saying that I joined for patriotism and whatever else, the thing I finally admitted was that I joined the military because I was in a toxic relationship. And that was one of the only choices I felt that I had. But also, when I look back now, understanding everything that I understand about groups and psychology, I think that I joined the military for all of the same reasons that my grandfather joined the Children of God cult in the 60s or early 70s, which was I needed a mission. I needed a purpose. When you've been raised in a cult, you're addicted to that. I needed to feel a sense of superiority. I definitely didn't realize that, but I did. And I also really just wanted to fit. I hadn't fit into a community at all for 6 years of high school and college. And I remember looking forward to basic training because I knew I would be good at it. I knew it would be easier than what I'd grown up with. And I really just looked forward to all you have to do is be in the right place, in the right time, in the right uniform, and don't volunteer for anything. Don't stand out. And I was like, this is going to be great. I'm going to be handed a uniform and a community, and all I have to do is follow the rules. And I'm good at that.
Performance and purpose, right? Like those are the highlights that come to mind. Is just give me the checklist, I'll check off. And also like finding there was probably some good stuff too, like in the sense of like wanting to be in touch with things you're skilled at, right? Like those things matter. So how long were you in the military before you were like, maybe this is not what I was, maybe I was idealizing this too much?
A few hours.
Nice. Yeah.
Actually, so when you just get to basic training, right? You are in for this week of what is called reception, which by the way is the same thing they call it in prison. And for this week, you're literally just being like dehumanized and entered into the system as part of a machine. So you're just like waiting around, standing in formations, which you don't know what a formation is before you show up and they tell you to do it. It's just a big square of humans. And you're getting your uniforms, you're getting all of this stuff. And everybody is going, what did I just do with my life? And then you go from there, you go to basic training. They keep you awake for 72 hours. And one of the first things you do when you get off the bus that brings you there is this exercise where they're screaming at everyone. They've had you pack all your gear into these Army green duffel bags. It weighs somewhere around 50 pounds, and you have to get it in the air and you have to hold it up. And they do it for about 2 to 3 hours. And so this is actually the prologue of my book, right? We're being yelled at. I'm standing there. We're doing this completely irrational thing. And I realized to myself, oh, I just joined another cult. And this duffel bag exercise is very important. So first of all, basic training in cult studies, we call this identity breaking indoctrination. They're going to break you down to build you back up. And there's a very interesting use of wacky rituals. And so this duffel bag thing is relevant, both because it's irrational and it's impossible, right? Nobody can do it. Everybody drops it. You get yelled at. You have to pick back up. This is why cults use perfection that's impossible to attain, because they want you to always think you're not good enough. And it's also irrational. Like, I'm willing to bet you've never gone outside and held 50 pounds above your head for 3 hours. And studies show that once you do the first irrational thing for a group, you are so much more likely to not question irrational things in the future as for it to be almost statistically not significant. And sure enough, like that's the night that when people are back in the barracks, you've either decided to push through and do this, or people try in the nicest way possible. I'm going to call this performative suicide. Like they would go draw very neat lines, light scratch lines on their wrist with a razor, and then go to the drill sergeant and be like, I'm suicidal, please send me home. And this this is the moment. And so this was when I knew, like, okay, this is another cult. And the interesting thing is that did not scare me. My actual first reaction was, great, I'm going to be good at this. I know how to do this. And it turns out, I found through sharing my story, that a lot of children from high control religions go into the military and do quite well, because honestly, the military does not ask us to do anything harder than what we grew up with in our childhood.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot there. My mind's racing because I'm seeing connections left and right. Definitely the identity breaking is a clear marker, right? Like the idea that how many boundaries can I push on this person? You know, how much can I make them do is like a classic cult abuse tactic. And then the other thing that's fascinating about that too, you talking about other people from either high control religions or just really any group that you have to perform in order to be valued. It makes sense that they would do well in an environment like that. And it's also interesting that it's early, that they they kind of want to separate the sheeps and the goats early, right? Like who's going to be willing to do what we need them to do. But I'm most curious about, this thought process that where you're going, I'm going to be good at this. And like not scared. Were you almost comforted by the system you were being presented?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And by the way, I think this is true for almost every neurodiverse person that joins the military, is that when there are so many rules by which you have to live your life, you know what you're supposed to do, versus just being dropped out by myself into the real world at 15. I had no clue how to act. I had no clue how to behave. I had no clue how to make friends, because everyone I'd ever been friends with in my life came from the exact same worldview. And I also just had this inherent knowledge that like the military wasn't going to be that hard, that I had literally grown up as, quote, a soldier in many ways. And so like I had done all this physically hard stuff, mentally hard stuff when I was 7. Doing it at 22 wasn't going to be that challenging.
Wow. Well, so like after, we'll fast forward through your story a little bit, but now you do continue to investigate group dynamics and power structures. Why on earth do you want to keep doing that after suffering so much abuse from systems like this?
It's interesting. One of the things I identified when I left the military, because I went into the military to be an intelligence officer, which was extremely competitive, and I got it. And the intelligence officer is the enemy expert, the expert on the enemy, the expert on the threat. And when I got out of the military, it was with full knowledge that like, I don't want to play this game. I don't want to be a soldier, but I'm really good at being an expert. So I need to find the next thing I'm an expert in. And I didn't set out to become an expert in cults and bad groups. I just started thinking a lot about culture and leadership. This is 2015. In 2014, culture was Merriam-Webster's word of the year. So this is like the heyday of culture and mission and values and everything in companies. And I was like, I know a lot about this. You can't spell culture without cult. I know more about group dynamics, I'm willing to bet, than the average person. So I did a lot of just like my own study for a long time. And then I went and signed up for a master's in organizational psychology. And I kind of define now organizational psychology as the study of groups in order to change them, right? And to make them quote unquote better. But there's very much this concept of we are the good guys. We don't want to talk about the bad guys. We don't want to talk about the bad groups. I actually formally petitioned Harvard to let me add their class on psychology of cults that covered Heaven's Gate, Jonestown, Children of God, why they worked, and where we see that in society around us. And I petitioned them to let me add it to my master's on organizational psychology. And their answer was no, because it's not about groups.
What?
And so on top of everything else, realizing that nobody wanted to talk about the bad stuff and the negative and the toxics and the dark triad of personality, which is narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, but also seeing that everyone was willing to take the tactics of these extreme groups and then try to whitewash them and use them in corporate America. And I was just like, nope, don't like it. But I also had this like very real realization that, they don't think of cults as groups, right? And they certainly don't think of them as successful groups. And now I have a talk that I give called What We Can Learn About Leadership from Cults. And I literally start off by saying, if I told you about an organization that was over 100,000 people, lasted for over 50 years, was all over the world doing high-risk missions and bringing in millions of dollars a year and has members that tend to stay dedicated for life, you would not tell me that is an unsuccessful organization until I tell you that I'm talking about the Taliban or the Children of God sex cult.
Yeah, it's fascinating the semantic moves people want to make to avoid the negativity. I mean, like, I agree that that's a huge thing. Part of why, there's a million reasons why I call Christianity a cult, but that's one of the biggest ones is I'm like, can we just use the word we need to use to discuss the problems we need to discuss instead of like trying to dance around other things?
And there's this dichotomy of good and bad, right? Children of God is a bad group. So how can we possibly learn anything about leadership or organizational behavior from them? Meanwhile, I would get told by people all the time, well, the US Army is a wonderful organization. And in both cases, I'm like, neither of these are strictly true. The Children of God was a very successful organization, and we can learn a lot from them. And also the US Army is 1.3 million humans trained to kill other humans as efficiently as possible. It's not inherently good.
Well, and that's one of the first questions I wanted to ask you about the military. And I know you're Army, military. I know there's some nuances between the different branches for sure. But you've explored group behavior extensively and experienced it yourself. So in what ways have you observed the U.S. military generally functioning? And what would you say is the point of the military? And I'm assuming that contrasts a little bit with what they'd want the average citizen to think what the point of the military is.
Yeah. So the point of the military, like what a military does, any military, is program individuals to conduct violence on behalf of state. Or as every colonel that I ever worked for in the Army seemed to like to say, we're not in the business of butterflies and flowers. We're in the business of killing people. But, of course, that's not what their official mission is, right? The official mission of the military is to protect American interests overseas and abroad. Fortunately for them, that is very vague. It's what I call a transcendent mission. It's very hard to define success, and you can put a whole lot under that. But when we boil it down, a military is programming individuals to fight on their behalf.
Yeah, and I think everyone knows that. It's just hard to say out loud because it's immediately like followed with like a sense of shame or guilt, right? Of all the cruelty.
Yeah, and I would push back a little bit on the idea that everybody knows that, because I think there has been so much propaganda in the US and so much of thinking we are the good guys. I mean, I got all the way through basic training, officer school, spy school, intelligence training, and got to deployed to Afghanistan. And I was flummoxed by how many people we killed. And I somehow managed to tell myself, like, I'm here to protect the good guys, right? Like, this is my job. And I completely missed the part of my job that was putting together what we literally called targeting packets, which is me saying, here, go kill this person, essentially.
Wow.
And I think, even now, like, there are reviews on my book that will say, well, what did she expect? She knew what she was signing up for. And, the US military, for at least the past 20 years, has had an incredible focus on mission and values and purpose. And we are the good guys and we're proud to be Americans. And I mean, I think you can serve 20 years almost like my husband did without really realizing like that's not what we're really about.
Well, and there's a couple of things that go into that, but I would assume some of it is just how young recruits typically are, to some extent. Do you think that factors in?
Absolutely. And I think that, cults want you when you're a teenager. The Children of God recruited people as young as 13. Military wants you when you're a teenager. Corporations want you when you're very, very young, right? Everybody at this point knows that if they get their hooks into you between the ages of 18 to 25, if not younger, then their chances of sort of keeping you for life in the military, that's 20 years, is much better.
Wow. I am curious about you. I'll blurb. I saw that you were a member of one of the Army's first female engagement teams. Do you think that challenged or reinforced the existing cult-like aspects within military culture? Because I assume there's not all, but it seems to be a pattern in cults that there's like patriarchy to some extent, or at least like an elevation of men. So I'm curious how that dynamic played out in the military.
Yes, absolutely a patriarchy. And I would say a very misogynistic, woman-hating patriarchy. And when I joined the military in 2009, I didn't know that it was still segregated by gender, but it was. And the interesting thing, too, is that the first women that they integrated onto combat teams did not go onto regular combat teams. We went into special, fancy, highly trained Rangers, special operations. My guys were called the Pathfinders, etc. And in that way, it very much was kind of like breaking into a cult, as you said, because, there are always cults inside of cults. And these had been very, very closed off to women. I also think that it was an experiment that they intended or truly believed was going to fail. I think the generals at the top were making this decision because of politics. It's time. We need women there. And they truly believed all of their pseudoscience that said women weren't going to be able to do it. And I think this because, well, one, we were sent into war without weapons, armor that would keep us alive, or any training. But two, when I went back to get the records and asked for what I was allowed to say about my service before I wrote a book, they told us that they didn't keep any records. And I think the US Army is only second to Nazi Germany in keeping records. So that is my belief. And the way I describe it is that they argued for 243 years about whether women were good enough to be men And since their answer was no, and since their assumption, their sacred assumption, if you will, was that men do combat best, the answer was women can't be in combat. What we learned as soon as we got there, which, by the way, we were greeted with open arms and thank God you're here by the guys on the ground who knew they needed us. And what we experienced was, in fact, a total reversal of what everyone thought, and that when both men and women are trying to kill you, it makes a lot of sense to have both men and women trying to keep you alive.
It's fascinating. I don't know why this popped into my head just now, but I'll just say it because it's interesting. I don't know if there's a point into me saying this. But I remember when my family changed churches when I was younger. And in Sunday school, for whatever reason, the guy was talking about women in the military. And he goes, the Bible never says shame on the women for going, but shame on the men for not. And don't know what his point was. Don't know what that was related to as far as topic goes. But it does make me think about just like those weird sort of baseline assumptions. And then even when they're being subverted, they're not necessarily being subverted in a way that is healthy. I don't know that do you have a reaction to that?
I mean, I think I think it's exactly what you're saying. So the U.S. Army, the U.S. military is a gender policing and enforcing organization, and especially was under the times of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And, you know, they don't want women, but since we're forced to have you here, you better be a proper woman. So, for example, if you have a pixie cut, like I did when I joined the military, oh, heavens no. If you are too in shape, I heard the phrase, well, Captain Mestyanek's not really a woman, about 1,000 times during my 6-year career. And, you know, so like you're still expected to be this perfect woman. And I was actually talking recently with one of the like highest ranking trans individuals in the infantry, who's a major now. And she was telling me that she doesn't think she'll ever get command, ironically, because they don't see her as a real woman.
It's fascinating, right? Because it's like my theory of cults, and again, like I work off more experience than necessarily study, though I've done a good bit of that too. But my experience investigating cults, what seems to be clear is that the whole purpose of having those genders be so explicitly defined is only for the sake of control, that the leaders can control easier if you're predictable, right? So like if you are contained within this expectation of gender, sexuality, whatever it is, it's all just it sounds like they'll try to moralize it like this is some sort of moral stance, but literally all it is just so the expectations can be crystal clear, both the ones that are imposed and for the leaders to expect certain things from you. Has that been your observation in the military too?
Yes. And the control, right? The fear. So under the combat ban, which said women couldn't do certain jobs in the military, you had to, when you joined the military, I had to climb on a table and have a male, old, creepy doctor kind of look up into my private parts to verify that I was a woman. And the way I explained this is they weren't afraid that we were going to sneak in and fail, because then we would out ourselves. They were afraid of a Mulan situation. They were afraid that we were going to sneak in and be perfectly successful as women and then prove their idea wrong. And also, you know, there was a philosopher, 1800s, named John Stuart Mills, who did all of his philosophy with his wife, who has this quote that says, "Of women's nature, the last word will never be written," which essentially is saying, like, we don't know what women are and what women are capable of, because we have always been so controlled and told who to be. And, you know, the military narrative literally was, you cannot be successful in combat because you cannot pull 300 pounds of dead weight out of combat. And there was never any thinking of like, oh, but Daniella can fit through a 24-inch circumference hole and open the gate, right? Can scale a wall easier. I literally had a male veteran once get in my face screaming that I couldn't beat him like a man. And what this man didn't understand was that my stiletto was about 2 seconds away from going through the top of his foot. I was going to beat him like a woman.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, wow. I mean, like, so many thoughts. Also, always love a John Stuart Mill quote being pulled. That's awesome. But yeah, do you think so many thoughts, but yes, this is a clear indicator of cult-like behavior. Do you think the military has to be cultish in order to commit the violence that it does?
I do not think so. And this is everybody's like first thing. First, they're like, why are you comparing it to a cult? That's so awful. And then when they realize the comparisons are valid, they go, oh, but it's a good cult. And then when I'm like, well, not exactly, they go, oh, well, we have to have that in order to do war. And again, I'm going to push back on this. So after World War II, where we all know what happened, and the Nazi trials decided for the world that I was just doing my job, I was told to do it, is not a defense. Since then, our US military has been changing, and we have been trying not to operate under the concept of you obey exactly what orders you are given. We've been trying to operate under this thing called mission command, which is actually about empowering the lowest level to make their own decisions. And for this reason, so enlisted people swear to obey the orders of the officers above them, but officers only swear their allegiance to the Constitution. This was a big deal, for example, when people thought maybe Trump was going to try a military coup, and just about every general came out publicly and said, just remember, your oath is to the Constitution, not to the commander-in-chief. So this concept that we need this absolutely brainwashed force in order to do war, maybe this was true in the days of war in trenches and hand-to-hand combat. I do not think in any way it is true in today's version of war. And also, fun fact, military psychologists do not go through basic training. They do not experience the identity-breaking indoctrination. So the first thing I'd like to see is the psychologists go through it, because they would immediately come out and say, what are we doing?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but don't some chaplains go through training?
I don't know if chaplains do. I think chaplains still come in through the special services. However, anyone who was prior enlisted or was a different kind of officer that crosses over to be a chaplain or a psychologist would have that basic training. So you do have some examples of people who have been through basic training, but for the most part, no. Chaplains also don't carry weapons ever.
Right. Yeah. Chaplaincy has always been interesting to me, because when I think when I was deconstructing, before I realized I was deconstructing, I was like, maybe I'd rather be a chaplain than a pastor. Like, was this kind of on my mind? And I look back now and go, oh, it's because you were starting to widen your spiritual beliefs and want to actually help instead of have a cult. And
it's interesting, because chaplain's assistant is a job in the military that you can sign up for before you join. And so a lot of very, very religious young people sign up to be the chaplain's assistant, completely not understanding that the chaplain's assistant is the person that carries the gun. is not somehow part of the ministry at all.
Interesting. Very sneaky. Don't like that. So
nope.
And interesting.
Just to say, this is another reason that I think that the military, everyone that goes in, is culty, because they have you sign black and white contracts. You do not know what you are signing up for, before you join. And you cannot negotiate your contract. And the first thing they tell you in basic training is forget everything your recruiter said, you're ours now. And so in many ways, being recruited into the military acts very much like love bombing in a cult. Recruiters are love bombing you. It's all about you. It's all about what you and your life and your family and your future can get out of the military. And then as soon as you're locked in, it's about the group.
Wow. This brings me to another kind of cult point. I've said many times that cults don't necessarily prey on especially vulnerable people. They prey on the vulnerabilities in all of us. Anyone who says I would never join a cult just doesn't understand what cults are. Do you think that's also true of the military, or are they more targeted towards vulnerable people, or is it literally the same thing where they can find the vulnerability in anybody?
So I would say both. I think that basic training is created to target the vulnerability of everybody. And so, the number one thing we'll hear from civilians is people be like, oh, I thought about the military, or I could never join the military because I asked too many questions. And it's always just kind of like soft internal laughter, because I'm like, yeah, that's the part of you they break. Like thinking that you could join the military and not be broken is very, very similar to people that think that they would never join a cult. That being said, I do think cults target vulnerable people. For example, my grandfather was sitting in a park with his head in his hands because the night before he'd had a bad LSD trip and met Satan, and up bounced these happy singing children of God people. And the image of him there in a park in the middle of the day with his head in his hands. And cult members are taught to approach people that look vulnerable. And military recruiters mostly recruit in city high schools where they think most of the children are coming from disadvantaged lives. They also heavily, heavily recruit in small town America, where one of your only choices for getting out of there is, college or the military. And I also sometimes wonder if the military preys on neurodiverse people, or just in some way really appeals to neurodiverse people who like rules and knowing the way everything goes. So, I definitely think that there are vulnerable populations, and it's a point that I've heard from Gen Z over and over again, that if we did universal education and universal healthcare in our country, nobody would join the military anymore. And the younger generation truly seems to believe that this is why politicians won't push those things forward.
I don't think it's necessarily far off. I mean, I've known some people who have escaped and done the annoying paperwork you have to do to get out of the military. Literally they joined because they thought they had no other options, and then kind of had a similar realization, like, wait, we're killing people. And it just kind of hit them. And it took a lot of energy to get out. So I definitely think that exists there for sure.
And let me talk about that leaving for a little bit, because this is actually this gave cult scholars a lot of heartburn when I first started saying, I think the military operates as a cult. And they were like, but you can leave. So let me walk you through that. About 80% of the military at any given point is under a service contract of several years, which absolutely means they cannot leave unless they would like to sit in jail. Like, it's the definition of you're not free to leave. But even if you are free to leave, it takes 6 months minimum for your paperwork to be processed, during which point you could be denied leaving, which is what happened to me because I get sick. I don't think you're there in the book yet. And they also have millions and millions of dollars to spend on retention campaigns to try to keep you in. And so, I said to multiple cult scholars who expressed their concern to me, I said, I personally found it far easier to leave the Children of God cult than to leave the U.S. Army.
I also think the free to leave thing gets a little too much. And this is the fun thing about cult expertise and cult like cult experts, if you will, is we're all okay with having a little bit of difference of opinions, which is super refreshing. The free to leave thing, I always say, I'm like, every cult will tell you you're free to leave. Every single
Exactly.
one will
And
tell
it's
you you're
not,
free to leave.
and I've specifically written about this in the book I'm putting out now, where it's actually the phrase you're free to leave is actually doing the opposite of telling you that you're free to leave. It's invoking all of the exit costs, and it's invoking the
Right.
thought of everything you had to do to be here, right? One of the exit costs of leaving the military, for example, is losing everything you worked so hard for. And so especially in groups that have high barriers to entry, like the medical field, the legal field, the military, et cetera, even teaching, just telling people you're free to leave. It's very similar to when people say, if you don't like America, then leave. Like, most people just don't have that choice. And providing these very black and white statements really, really is just there to camouflage how difficult it is to leave high demand groups.
Definitely. And there's kind of two false choices, right? Like the one false choice is the practicalities, right? Like can you afford to leave? Like literally, can you afford it? And like those kind of factors. But there's also the psychological leaving cost, right? Of like, in something like an evangelicalism, you might be leaving the belief that you'll see your loved ones again. That's like deeply like a psychological thing to say bye to if that's the choice you make, right?
Absolutely. And
yeah.
Psychologists estimate that leaving our high control groups feels like death. Just because
it's certainly
of
at
that.
least a divorce, which also sometimes feels like death. So,
it's funny because I wrote this whole book that parallels my cult experience and my military experience. And I didn't even get in to the shunning and the exit costs and everything that happens when you choose to leave, because my book ends right when I make that choice. But I say that of all of the parallel experiences between military and cult, the way that they fearmonger, the way they tried to tell me, like, Daniella, nobody's going to love you on the outside, right? Their version of this is you're going to miss the camaraderie, which is really interesting as a woman, and especially a woman officer, to look at them and be like, what camaraderie? Like, you didn't let me have any friends the whole time I was here. But also just the fear mongering of like, what are you going to do in the outside world? I remember a major, I was sharing that at the time my plan was to go to Vanderbilt and get an MBA. And he was like, you just think you can waltz into an Ivy League institution? And well, first of all, it's not Ivy League. And second of all, I salsa danced into Harvard. But yes.
Right.
yes, I do think I can survive in the outside world. But I literally, I remember repeatedly thinking that if I was not a well-educated Army captain who had already left a cult at 15, I would be scared because people were actively trying to scare me about leaving the military.
Yeah, incredible. Another dynamic in the military I just wanted to talk about a little bit, because my own personal definition, I love how we all have our own definitions of a cult. It actually does genuinely bring me joy that we're not all just agreeing to the same mission statement.
I know, I love
it. But mine is just the simple, the soundbite version is when leaders control, contain, and convert followers. But the leader follower distinction is a big one for me, right? Because I'm not necessarily big on the single charismatic leader bit, but I'm certainly big on there's a sharp distinction between who a leader is and who a follower is. So how do you think those dynamics manifest within the military, or maybe they do have a healthier version of it? And do you need that kind of leader follower dynamic for the military to function?
So, it's always funny to me when people try to say that their group can't be a cult because it doesn't have a leader. And I'm over here going like, humans have not come up with leaderless groups yet. That's not a thing.
Right.
So like your group definitely has a leader. And people will say, oh, the army doesn't have a leader. And I'm like, he's called the commander in chief. And we literally have to stare at photos of him every day and do anything he says. But also, I think with any large organization, you have to look at what I call like the unit level. So of course you have arguments about how all of Christianity is a cult, but I'm sure that certain like churches are like more intense cults. And
Absolutely.
this is where I really think
for sure.
I really think you need to. But I mean, the army absolutely has exact divisions between leaders and followers, which is your officers and your enlisted. Like it is management versus line workers. And you are definitely taught that you will go along with what the leader says. And we say that individuals are supposed to be able to stand up to the leaders if they're training you, telling you to do something illegal. But that's not what we train. That's not the culture of the group. And I'll give you an example. We all heard about Hillary's emails, and we heard many, many people go, if I had done that, I would be in jail. Every boss I ever had ordered me to do illegal things with secret information. And I would tell them once, and then I would tell them twice, and then I would do it because that's what you have to do in the military. That's the power of the leader and the leader's word.
Well, and I think there's a very important nuance here that some people miss, and as far as like misconceptions of cults go, is that there's no accountability for the leader, and that's true, but there's like a thing I want to add every time someone says something like that, and it's like, but they'll say there is. Like there's always like a kind of pseudo mechanism of accountability in these kind of abusive groups, right? And it sounds like there's something like that in the military, and there's certainly stuff like that in religious cults, where it's like, no, we have this whole system in place in case the leader starts going off the rails. But what ends up happening is that system is like a moving goalpost that changes based on the scenario, and essentially ends up meaning nothing.
And so, there was a couple articles written about this 10 years ago in the military. The military has 7 values that spell out the acronym of leadership. And one of those values is honesty. And we are very specific about honor violations and training and all of this stuff. And yet someone at West Point sat down and counted it once. And there is more required training in the Army than there are training days, than there are work days, which means that every single lieutenant and captain that have to sign off that, yes, I did all the things I was supposed to do, by definition are lying. And yet you have to do it.
Wow.
And everybody knows it. And the senior officer that's receiving the sign off knows that you didn't do it because it's impossible. And so, I mean, it's everything in the officer world. Like we're taught that everything is about leading a team, but everything in training and in our actual careers is individual competitions against other officers. Like it just is in so many ways. We say one thing, but the reporting that we require is another thing. And I always think your values are found in the reporting you require, not in the things you say.
Oh, 100%. And it also points back to another parallel that I'm seeing between that and religious cults, which is the demands are impossible. Like by nature, what they are demanding is impossible for you to do, but they just are counting on the cognitive dissonance to make the thing function anyways.
Right. And with cults, you see this a lot with purity requirements. So, purity requirements, I define as any black and white version of I don't do X. I don't put X in my body. I don't put X in my mind. It's, I only read this. I only drink this. I only eat this. Obviously, sexual purity comes into it. But the way that cults use purity requirements is absolutely the knowledge that nobody can do it. Nobody can achieve perfection. And that keeps you striving, right? So if we think about the duffel bag example, nobody can stand there with 50 pounds over their head for 3 hours. If somebody could, that person would not experience the psychological effect of the exercise. They would just stand there for 3 hours and be like, okay, I'm awesome, and go on to the next thing. And they would not have been taken through this portal of like having to commit to the group, even when they ask you to do impossible and irrational things.
Wow. So, how do we fix it? Like, are there any measures or changes that could make the military a healthier organization, or make the culture at least healthier?
Yes. First of all, I think loyalty is an incredibly dangerous value for an organization, and that is the military's first value in the acronym of leadership. I think that when we are loyal to another person, that means we are willing to go against our own morals if they need us. When you are loyal to an organization, that means you are going to be willing to go against your own morals when the group asks, and the group will always eventually ask. So loyalty, extremely toxic value. And I think they need to just completely rethink the whole value system. Like, look, Enron had the value of honesty carved in marble out front of their headquarters in Houston. Like, just saying you have values and doing all this stuff around it, like, doesn't make it so. But I think two big changes would really change a lot. And that would be a change to basic training. The concept that like you don't have to completely break people and rebuild them in your image, because we are not trying to create mindless killing machines anymore. And then there's a very strong culture in the Army of what I call not listening to the new guy, and not listening to the point that it becomes shunning of the outgoing people. And I think that if we changed that, we would see a whole lot of changes. But right now, the military very much operates under this, what I call sit down and shut up, Lieutenant, which is, you point out anything strange or just something that's not valid in today's age, and you'll just get told, this is the way we've always done it. You're new. You don't know anything. Just go along to get along.
Yeah. And all of that can be traced back to like fear, right? Like there's just like, and you'll see it in corporations, you'll see it all the time, but just like leadership genuinely thinking that the status quo is functioning fine and any challenges to that could be detrimental, which is such a bad way to just view life, to be honest.
And what you said about that is so true in the military. There is this ironclad assumption that the military is the oldest organization. We know how to do war. We have all of this history, and changes are bad. And I am even told all the time, like, well, what do you want, Daniella? When you call the Army a cult, like, we're always going to have war. And not only do I not think that we will always have war when women are 50% in charge of the world, but there's actually some interesting research in organizational psychology around risk-taking behavior that shows that when men are with women or by themselves, they tend to always make the moderate choice, the same way that non-male humans do always. But when men are with other men, they almost always tend to take the riskier choice. And we're talking about this research, and everyone in my class is going, what about family? What about business? And I'm like, what about war?
Yeah.
This concept that you have to have war, I think, is a sacred assumption that just absolutely blinds people to progress.
I agree. And unfortunately, probably no surprise, I think it goes deeper culturally. So like, I think Christianity has a hand in some of this too. So I'm curious, just how do you view the relationship between Christianity and the military? And do you think they benefit from each other in any way?
Okay, so I will speak specifically for the U.S. Army. I know this is probably true for the other branches, but the U.S. Army is not just a Christian organization, it is an evangelical, evangelizing Christian organization. In the 101st Division, at a very famous military school called Air Assault School, where you go rappel out of helicopters, and it's a requirement for very many positions, you are required for graduation to bow your head during the prayer and then sound off with a resounding amen. And this is just throughout the military. I was counseled by every senior leader I ever had that putting atheist on my resume, basically, because our religions are on our resumes in case, we die, that putting atheist would hurt my career. And I always described it in the Army. There's a tolerance for not being a Christian if you're something else. If you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, if you're Catholic, we're okay with that. But if you're just a little white blonde girl that is choosing not to be a Christian, how dare you? And I have had to tell senior officers to step back and watch out because they are proselytizing to me so hard in uniform during military exercises.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways that's shocking, and in other ways it's not. It's part of my analysis, kind of processing that would be, well, there's probably a couple things at play, but one, if you have some sort of religion, maybe you're more willing to die. Could be part of that. Why, that, or at least, subconsciously something like that. And then, yeah, I just think that Christianity specifically offers such a militant mindset that it makes sense that they would want to subtly promote it one way or another.
Yeah. And I also just think that's who holds the power in America.
Right.
We still haven't had a non-Christian president.
Wild.
And as much as we try to say, American doesn't have a culture, have you looked at the Puritans? They fit every definition of a cult.
Yes.
There is definitely a Christian culture, a Christian undertone. And, not for nothing, the Christian Bible is very violent and full of war. So they go together quite well.
Correct. As one with a degree in it. Correct. It is not a G-rated book by any means. I've also, but it's fascinating even going a little further on that Christian culture thing, because, earlier you said that even the PR version of the military's purpose is the, protect America's interest. Well, if part of that interest is Christianity, that can get really problematic really quick.
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think that what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan was a crusade, right? It was a religious war.
Yeah.
And yep. we like to think it was a religious war only on the side of the Muslims, and I disagree with that.
Well, there's plenty of evidence to support you because, I mean, for one thing, just the pure rhetoric here after 9/11 was pretty insane. But beyond just rhetoric, also in recent, Trump literally tried to ban Muslims, which I feel like the weirdo who just hangs on that one crazy thing he did. But I'm like, do y'all not realize how insane that is to try to ban a religion from your country? That's the thing we say that other countries do. And our president wanted to do it. That's insane.
That was supposed to be what our country was founded on. But, it's so interesting. Part of what I described as my experience of living in America is Americans all think they're so different from cults, but yet I just see so many similarities. And when we really think about it, what the Puritans did, running away from their country to go somewhere else where they could practice their religion exactly how they wanted it, is exactly the same thing Jim Jones did when he took his followers to Guyana. It's exactly the same thing David Berg did when he had his people flee all over the world, escaping religious persecution. So I just go into this concept of like, we like to think about our history as black and white and our culture as black and white. And like, no, it's not, like religious freedom is incredibly important. Most people believe. Also, children like me were sacrificed on the altar of religious freedom because cults are the best at weaponizing religious freedom.
Right. Absolutely. And clearly the way that those two words pair together now means something that is not freedom. That is just tyranny, in my opinion. I think that I agree that like people should be able to believe whatever the hell they want. I have no care or desire to change what someone internally believes about anything. Like I really don't. It more, but we all got to get along somehow. And I don't think Christians always understand that. But do Christians make good soldiers or bad soldiers, depending on your point of view? And do you think with, upticks in Congress and such, like using straight up unapologetic Christian nationalist rhetoric, even identifying as a Christian nationalist, do you think the military is more resistant or accepting of that kind of Christian nationalism?
So I absolutely think Christians make better soldiers. I think, what you said as far as being more willing to die if you are religious, I think is completely true. But even like familiarity with that kind of passion in a belief, right? So even ex-Christians make excellent soldiers because we know how to buy in. And we know, when you were raised as an apocalyptic child to grow up and die for God, like the concept of going and dying for an organization that you've chosen to buy into and become a believer in isn't that different. And also, there's this point in my book where I'm getting recruited for like special fancy black ops. And I tell the guy that I grew up all around the world as a missionary kid, and he goes, they actually sometimes call the CIA Christians in Action because of how many missionary kids we recruit. Mormons, huge amount of Mormons in the military. And I just think that the idea that you have to self-sacrifice for the greater good, sometimes this is going to hurt, but you still got to do it for this ultimate outcome, is embedded in Christians from birth. And so the concept of just like transferring that to a military, I think is easy for people.
Definitely. And there's plenty of anecdotes that prove that in your book. I'll give one that I think I've told on the pod before, but, I remember being in Sunday school and us doing like this weird role play where we had to like get down on the ground and the Sunday school teacher was like pretending to hold a gun to our head. And we had to say, that we don't renounce Jesus. And if we didn't do that, like we messed up, and like people, and I wasn't in like, one of these perceived like crazy cults. I was just at a local church. Like literally it was like a local church that nobody would think anything like that would be going on at, and I know that story is not uncommon. Like, well, it's just this
I'm sure you know the story that came out of Columbine, right? That was a total myth, but that they walked up to a Christian girl and said, "Are you a Christian?" And she said yes, and they shot her in the face. And that story was incredibly powerful for Christianity because, you have this analogy, right, of like someone as a soldier of God, as a martyr for their cause. I think if you can get people willing to die for something, they're going to be incredibly committed.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it's really, I mean, to be perfectly blunt, it's the origin of Christianity is this myth of martyrdom, of like being willing to die for something. I mean, it's what their leader allegedly did. And further than that, it even got like redefined in the early years of Christianity as far as like not only fake martyrdom stories, but real suicide cults based on the idea of Jesus being the first, suicide for a cause in some sense. And that's not extreme to say. This is just history,
Right.
like, and so regardless of whether you think it's like the spiritual beliefs have merit or not, it is important to understand the absolute seriousness with which Christianity teaches that you need to be ready to die. And I think that's broader and sometimes missing because people want to be nice, but it is true that is like an embedded doctrine.
And, even this concept of uniqueness, right? So I have these lists. One is called the Guru Gotcha checklist, and one is called toxic AF, red flags for toxic AF groups. And in both of these lists, a focus on your own uniqueness is one of the big red flags. And I just always, with Christians, I'm just flabbergasted that they think this concept of Jesus is so unique. Because I think almost everybody would be willing to die to save the entire world, right? That's what the movie Armageddon is about.
You would think. Yeah.
And it's like, they're like, oh, Jesus was willing to die for you. Okay, every mother ever. Right? Like it's not that unique. It's not that special. But the concept of a leader who dies for their people or is willing to die for their people is an extremely powerful thing that you can use to pull people into your worldview.
Definitely. And the Christian argument would be like it's a God who was willing to die, which is obviously nonsensical with their other doctrines, but like that is sort of the poetry of it all.
Yeah, and we see this in my book where I ask my combat team, I'm like, this leader who's the same rank as me but commands so much respect over his team, and I ask them, like, what is it? And he says to me, we all know that he would die for us. So we'll do anything for him.
And there is something beautiful there. I don't want to take away from it, but I would also say that like as far as the uniqueness thing, the joke I often make is they're promising that one day I'll, reap the rewards of forgiveness, or I could just go to therapy and get forgiven even quicker. Like it really is not that special.
There's this quote from Eric Hoffer, who was a philosopher who wrote a lot about the true believer. And he says, I'm going to paraphrase it, but I used to wonder why people were willing to die for their beliefs. And he says, I think that no matter how different the beliefs people are willing to die for, they perhaps die for the same thing. Which, in my translation is just the rightness of your belief. You are so convinced that you are right, that you're willing to die for it. And I think being willing to die on. Yeah. And I think being willing to die for a belief is part of the definition of extremism.
Certainly. And even more extreme when you think everybody should be willing to die for that same belief. Exactly. That's when it gets even more insane. So my theory is probably pretty transparent that I think the military is almost like, especially those who aren't in the military, it's like a fantasy for Christians because they are indoctrinated to believe that they are part of a militant spiritual war. I mean, that is part of the belief, no matter how you spin it. And the idea that fighting the good fight, it just reinforces some of, in my opinion, their most extreme and deadly beliefs. Is that too harsh an accusation to levy against Christianity?
No, I don't think it's too harsh of an accusation. I make this exact analogy in the Children of God, or in my book, that I was born a soldier. And the cover of my book is a picture of me in tinfoil armor at the age of 2. We truly, truly believed in this militant aspect. And I will tell you, just anecdotally, when my husband and I meet Christians, that find out we are veterans and we are not Christian, I mean, they get angry. It like shatters this fantasy that they have of what the military is.
Yeah, I mean, that's telling, isn't it? And and I think like people want that to be softer somehow. And like I'm trying to figure out a way to speak it softer, but I don't know if there is.
I mean, but also because of this fantasy, we're willing to basically believe complete falsehoods. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've had like a white Christian male Republican be like, and this is why we win wars. And I'm just like, do you know the last time we won a war? Like, you know,
and winning a war to them is sometimes just some amount of death, which is also kind of upsetting to really break down. But yeah, like most war now is not really winning and losing. It's placating and politicking, and it's very disturbing.
Yeah, but this idea, right, this concept that we have, this belief that like the US is number one, the US military is number one, like, okay. You know?
Yeah, and there's certainly an inherent like exceptionalism and narcissism that goes along with that. And again, I think it's just hand in hand. You know, I can remember like, you know, in all the churches I grew up, there was like automatic reverence given for veterans. It wasn't even a question. I've been to some churches where there's an American flag on stage, which even when I was a Christian, I was like, what is that about? Because Christianity at the end of the day will actually say your allegiance is to God over country. And I think even the Christian nationalists are lying a little bit and saying that like what they don't actually really give a shit about the country, to be honest. It's just a land for them to occupy, and it's a kingdom for them to establish. But if they were in another country, they'd be happy to dominate that one too.
You know, an important thing about Christian nationalists too that I think people miss sometimes is they want the world to burn. You know, cult members often want the apocalypse to occur, so much so that a cult leader will often precipitate his own apocalypse, like David Koresh in Waco and Jim Jones in Jonestown. And also going back to this thing you said about the superiority and the exceptionalism, I think this is a really important thing to highlight. And I think this is also one of the reasons that people go cult hopping when they get out of their cults, is that cults ultimately give us a sense of superiority and exceptionalism. Our group is right. Our purpose is right. Our God is right, whatever it is. And it's not necessarily something that's easy for us to see. And so I describe, you know, my life was kind of like, okay, first I'm a missionary in the Children of God, so I'm better than you. And then I'm a super student, so I'm better than you. And then I'm a soldier, so I'm better than you. And even as a soldier, I was a super athlete, so I'm better than you. And then I got out of the military and I tried to work like a normal job at Microsoft, and I just fell apart. And for me, realizing the superiority was what I was chasing was just like a huge part of my deconstruction. And we know that people join cults out of fear because the world is so confusing. They want clarity. People want to be told exactly what to do. And subconsciously, when we leave our cults, I think the problem we're trying to solve is, well, what's going to make me special? How am I going to know that I'm right? And the reality is you're not. You're not special. You're not any more right than anyone else. Like, we are all just here guessing and doing our best.
Well, I can't say it any better than that. So, Daniella, thank you for coming on. This has been a pleasure. Unfortunately, this is my last season of this podcast. So normally I'd invite you back, but I don't have anything to invite you back to. So hopefully we'll continue to talk, though, and continue to do stuff in the future, because I think your work is so important. If people want to read your book or find out more about you, where should they go? What's the easiest way to do that?
So you can buy Uncultured anywhere you buy books. It is a memoir, so it is very different from this conversation. It is a story that brings you through the parallels of the cult in the military, The New York Times says the audio is great, so you can also get the audio.
Can confirm.
And then
audio is great.
Thank you. If you want to just know more about this, I would say I'm fantastically fun on TikTok, where I'm always knitting and talking about cults and group behavior and kind of crowdsourcing my process of writing The Culting of America. So I'm just sharing all of my research and having these ongoing conversations with people. So please come join me on TikTok. If you search #GroupBehaviorGal on most of your social media, you'll find me. Also on Threads, where we have fascinating conversations about cults. So definitely come check us out.
Yep. Big Threads fan. Again, Daniella, thank you so much for coming on. And thank you, listener, for stopping by. I'll talk to y'all soon. This is the final season of The Cult of Christianity. But this is not the last time I will be investigating religions and cults. If you'd like to continue to follow my work, go to jverner.com or follow my Substack at johnverner.substack.com. You can also continue to support my work by going to thecultofchristianity.com and subscribing for a giant backlog of bonus content and stay up to date when my next big project releases. Thank you for listening, subscribing, sharing, reviewing, and as always, keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.